Hello, I'm Rick Gilbert. The video you are about to see is the most consequential interview I have ever done. It is with a man named Daniel Ellsberg. Those of you that grew up in the 60s, you will undoubtedly remember his name associated with the Pentagon Papers. Those of you that are under 40 may be a little bit less sure about this history, but here's the way it went. Ellsberg worked for the Rand Corporation, which is a pro-government policy think tank. When he began to realize that the Vietnam War was terribly wrong and that he alone must do something to make a difference, he stole the 7,000-page top secret document, made copies of it, and gave it to the New York Times. That act helped to bring the war to a conclusion sooner and helped to get Richard Nixon impeached. Daniel Ellsberg put his own life and future in huge jeopardy when he did that. He fully expected that he might end up going to jail for his entire life. As it turned out, his case went to the United States Supreme Court, where the court sided with Ellsberg and with the New York Times. Talking to Daniel Ellsberg is an unforgettable experience. When I spent an hour with him last week, I felt that I was maybe even in the presence of Gandhi, Martin Luther King, John Brown, Rosa Parks, the people in our history who have been willing, because of conscience, to put their lives on the line. I know you'll enjoy getting to meet Daniel Ellsberg. Thanks for watching.
When my wife and I were, you can see the picture of it at that moment up there, I was surrendering to the authorities after 13 days, so-called underground, of putting out the Pentagon Papers. I was about to go be arrested in Federal Square in Boston, and a reporter asked me, how do you feel about going to prison? And I said, wouldn't you go to prison to help shorten this war? And really, I've learned later that most people's answer to that would be no. I was not aware then how unusual it is to be willing to give up a job, just to give up a job, no matter how many people's lives are at stake. In order to save those lives, it turns out to be very unusual. At the time, it seemed to me that I was simply following in the footsteps of the people who were going to prison for draft resistance, and 5,000 of them did go to prison. 50,000 were in the court system. So I thought of myself at that time as just one of them. You mentioned the accident. We were on our way to visit my mother's relatives in Denver from Detroit. And on the 4th of July, on a very hot day in the cornfields of Iowa between Davenport and Des Moines, actually, my father fell asleep at the wheel, went off the road, and couldn't get back on when it woke him up, the bumping. And the side of the car was sheared off. My mother and sister, 11 months younger than me, were killed. I was in a coma for 36 hours. In Davenport, and then moved by my relatives to Denver, to a hospital there. My father, being a Christian Scientist, did not want my leg set. And, I didn't mention that it broke my leg as well. I also had the concussion from a scar here, an open flap on my skull.
So you were unconscious after
I was unconscious for 36 hours. And he didn't want that sewed up, so I had the scar till I was about 40. My leg was broken just above the knee, and he didn't want it set. Even though Christian Scientists do permit setting of bones, actually, it's regarded as kind of carpentry rather than medicine. But you're not supposed to use the services of any doctor for health reasons. Nevertheless, he didn't want it set, and so when I was taken to Denver by my Jewish relatives in a Jewish hospital there, they had to re-break the bone and set it. And they said had they not done that, my right leg would be 1.5 inches shorter than my left. So that made quite a difference. As it was, I can't bend my knee all the way here, my right knee. And I had to get a surgeon's permission to go in, approval to go into the Marine Corps in 1954 because I couldn't bend my knee. So when the surgeon examined the knee with an X-ray and flexion and so forth, he said, "You're okay. They'll never take you." I said, "You don't understand. I'm here to get your permission, your approval to go." He looked at me like this, and then, as a joke, I take it, but seriously, he gave me a slip and said, "Take to the psychiatrist at the end of the hall, to be examined for wanting to go in." But that was a joke. In the Marine Corps, I was excused from the kneeling position on the rifle range, which is the hardest position to make a good score in. So it improved my score. And later in life, it's excused me from the lotus position in meditation if I accompany my wife to that. Well, that's the word you could use. Going off the road, in effect, sleeping at the wheel, all these metaphors, which were not a metaphor in the case of my father, I think did impress me even at the time. It's a longer story, but I had actually been very skeptical, very concerned about the atom bomb a year earlier, and had very uneasy feeling that it had been a mistake to start on that path of a nuclear war. And a year later, when my father went off the road, I think in a way I conflated those events in my life, that someone you loved and respected and gave authority to still had to be watched because they could make a very great error of judgment. It so happens that I had a social science teacher in 9th grade at Cranbrook who told us about the possibility of a U-235 bomb, having been told that just before secrecy put that under a cover in 1939. And he told us this in 44. Of course, the bomb wasn't dropped till 45, but already it was clear to me and my other classmates that this would be a development of a bomb 1,000 times more powerful than the blockbusters of World War II. There would be a sinister, ominous development for humanity. Well, my brother, who was 11 years older, half-brother, his mother, my father's wife, had died before he married my mother. And he was a very great influence on me. I loved him. He was my best friend and definitely a mentor. He was in the Air Force during the war. He was quite radical. And I, in a way, diverged from him politically in the late 40s as I became a Cold Warrior and felt that he was radical, and he oriented me toward a career in the labor movement, actually, which I expected to do. And I joined the UAW, the United Auto Workers, at 17, which required my father's approval. He was a Republican. He was anti-war, anti-union, but my brother was very pro-union. And so I joined them and was looking toward a career in labor economics as a labor organizer or possibly a labor economist. I was in the Marines from 54 to 57. I liked the Marines very much, my experience in the Marines. That was peacetime. And I did volunteer to stay in an extra year, actually, when I thought my battalion was moving toward combat in the Suez crisis, which was realistic to some extent. You ask what made the change. 2 years of being in a war in Vietnam, which was clearly not going to succeed in any terms whatever. It could only be protracted. And our only hope could be to avoid recognizing that we had lost, or avoid leaving, avoid defeat. For that, millions of Vietnamese died and 58,000 Americans died, to avoid a president having to say, we lost. But I felt that in order to get it stopped, the public needed to know just how realistic and pessimistic the estimates were inside and how they'd been lied to all this time. So that made me willing to cease being a president's man and to get out. The presidents, even Kennedy and Johnson and earlier Eisenhower and later Nixon, saw it in much these terms. We must avoid losing Vietnam while I'm in office.
Losing face, yes.
And for that, it's all right for any number of people to die, to avoid that, and to be killed by us. But I felt, even by that time, that it was hopeless. But I didn't see what I should do about it until I had the example of young Americans who were going to prison to protest the war. Like them, what can I do to shorten this war now that I'm ready to go to prison? And that made me think, within a few weeks, of putting out the Pentagon Papers, which were 7,000 pages of top secret history of the decision-making in the war, which was one long litany of lies and foolish choices and criminal choices. But I gave that to the New York Times eventually and faced 12 felony counts. I was the first person prosecuted for putting out the Pentagon paper. It was an occasion when at the conference, as I describe in the book, when one of these young men I spoke of, Randy Keeler, announced that he was going to prison shortly, or actually his trial had not begun, but he expected to go to prison, and he did go to prison. And I was struck by it as if an axe had struck my head almost, split my life in two, really. I went to a men's room at the back of the auditorium, and small room that people weren't using, sat down and just cried for about an hour. I cried and thought, this is what my country has come to, as I thought about when Bobby was killed. And the best thing this young man can do in his life is to go to prison. And that may well be true of my son, who was then 14, I think, and who was 18 when the war was still going on, and he did send in his draft card. But then Nixon ended the draft before he was tried or indicted. So I thought, my country has come to a terrible situation, and it is worth risking giving my freedom. I thought I would go to prison for the rest of my life. And that's what Nixon intended for me, with the charges, a possible sentence of 115 years. And it was not until Chelsea Manning in 2010 took steps that she knew might put her in prison for life or even capital punishment, and was willing to do that by putting out many thousands of pages, more than I could in the Xerox age. With digital accounts, she was able to put out hundreds of thousands of pages. 3 years later, Ed Snowden did that, and he is in permanent exile from this country. He would be in prison for life if he came back. He would not have a fair trial. He would not be in the prison population. He would almost surely be in solitary confinement, as Chelsea was for 10 and a half months until public protest got her out. So it turns out that I identify very much with those two people. Yes. I very much unreservedly wish that I had put this information out in 1964, and I think it really could have helped prevent the Vietnam War. That's a very heavy load to bear, and I didn't see it until years later. It worked out in a way that could not have been foreseen. Namely, Nixon was so panicked at the thought that someone was putting out his truths, or I should say earlier truths, documents, that he was afraid that I would put out documents showing that he was still making nuclear threats against Vietnam. He had in '69 and was still doing it in '71 and '72. He was afraid that I would reveal that, and he took criminal actions to stop me. So he sent people into my former psychoanalyst's office to get information to blackmail me with. That was criminal. He sent people to incapacitate me totally on the steps of the Capitol. He was overhearing me with warrantless wiretaps that had no court warrant, which was at that time criminal. It's not now, after the Patriot Act and after 9/11. But these were crimes that he had taken. He used the CIA against an American citizen, me, not only for the burglary and these use of these CIA assets, but to make a psychological profile of me by a psychologist who worked for the CIA. And partly they went into the doctor's office to get more information for that profile with which to manipulate me, to see what my psychological vulnerabilities were. All these things were then crimes. Actually, none of them are now, clearly. Ended with Nixon in office. He intended to renew and continue the bombing to keep Tew in power and as long as he was. And actually, amazingly, Tew was in office longer than Nixon was. No one could predict that Nixon would be out of office after his landslide victory in 1972, that he would be out of his office before 1977, out of his office in 1974, facing impeachment. That was impossible. It wasn't just unlikely. It was impossible. But it did happen. And it would not have happened without his concern about me that led him to take criminal acts, and the acts by a number of other people that were unusual, that were out of ordinary for a bureaucrat. Alexander Butterfield revealing the taping in the Oval Office, of which he was one of a handful of people who know that that existed. A Republican, an official, he told that truth to Congress. Without that, Nixon would have stayed in office. Elliot Richardson refuses to fire the special prosecutor. And then the next man in line, Ruckelshaus, refuses to fire the special prosecutor under orders from the president. They're both fired. Without their acting that way, Nixon stays in office. The tapes don't come out. So a lot of people had to take unusual career moves, that unusual because they tended to threaten their careers. And Dean, facing John Dean, choosing to shorten his sentence by telling the truth about a president. Hardly anyone else did that, no one else at that point. So it was a courageous act for him. As a result, Nixon was out of office. The war was ended 9 months later. It would not have. So if you're saying what was the big benefit, my putting out the Pentagon Papers were one necessary link in a chain of 50, 100 other events, each of which was also necessary, that did shorten the war. That was more than I'd hoped. Well, you know that the arms makers benefit. War is the most profitable of the merchants of death, merchants of homicide, merchants of arms. So Boeing, Lockheed, Grumman, General Dynamics, all profit very much during a war. Do you need another reason? It turns out, no, that's enough. Because they give contributions, they employ people in all of 50 states. There are jobs at stake. There are political donations to Congress at stake and to the president. So they're all kind of in hock to corporations in general, to rich donors of various kinds, corporations. But in the area of war, I increasingly believe that the effect of the arms makers is very great, and that's a sufficient reason. Now there are other reasons. We have a politics now that's so oriented toward maintaining a military budget, and thus maintaining enemies that justify a military budget, that it's very risky for a politician to go against that, whether he's a congressperson or a president, and none of them have. None of them has been willing to be charged with being weak, and to get that charge, it's enough to lower the defense budget, and none of them have done that.
Final question. What would your advice be for younger people who have your sense of consciousness about these things and want to take action, make a difference? What kind of advice would you have?
Well, it would certainly be a mistake to do as I did, to feel that your best way of serving the country is within the executive branch and to work for the president. that's a mistake. There is Congress, although they're looking like the servile instruments of presidents right now, and have been, but that needs to change if we're going to survive as a democracy or even as a species when you look at climate and nuclear weapons. Investigative journalism can be truth-telling, academic work, various investigations, truth-telling in general, which is generally risky in any bureaucracy, truth-telling, and yet it can be worth your life or your freedom. So I would tell them that. Don't do what I did if you know information that the country is going wrongly. Don't wait till the bombs are actually falling or until many thousands more have died before you consider risking your own freedom by putting out documents and putting out those truths, if you're in a position to do that. And many people are, not only in the government, but in corporations in general, where harmful behavior is going on, and they consider whether or not to be a whistleblower. The costs of telling those unwelcome truths tend to be very great. And therefore, it's not reasonable in general, it's not obligatory to tell those truths at whatever cost if the truths aren't that important. If it's say, but often they are. There may be many lives at stake, and not only in the government. That's at the Rand Corporation. I've never been able to go back. I would have liked to explain what I did and face their challenges, or whatever they are, but it would be a very risky thing for them to do it, and I can understand they're not wanting to do it, because I am like those people in many respects. And if what I did was the right thing to do, maybe they should be considering it, and that's not something the president of Rand wants them to consider.